In this session, we're going to give an overview of the cerebrum and the cerebellum. So we're going to talk about the structure and the main functions of the cerebrum. We won't go into too much depth. And likewise, we'll talk about the structure and functions of the cerebellum. Again, not going into too much depth. But of course, what we will do is we'll try and integrate these two structures together, because together they allow us to have smooth, coordinated movements. So the cerebrum and the cerebellum together work to make us have coordination of our voluntary muscles, so our skeletal muscles. So if we're looking at the CNS, as you'll know, the central nervous system is composed of the brain and the spinal cord. The adult brain has about 97% of all of the body's neural tissue, so a huge amount. The rest obviously being within the peripheral nervous system and the spinal cord, and within the GI tract. You've got a volume of about 1.2 litres. It ranges from 0.7 to 2.1 litres, with the male brain being 10% bigger. But there is no correlation between brain size and intelligence. So boys, you can't go saying that you've got a bigger brain, so therefore you're clever. It does not work like that. If we're looking into the structures themselves, you've got your cerebrum, and on the outer 2 to 4 millimeters of the cerebrum, you've got your cerebral cortex. Now, the cerebral cortex is basically grey matter. It's processing power. It's where you integrate all the information to give you that integration of information. You also have within the cerebrum, you'll have the white matter, and the white matter is all about cables. So it's transmitting information from one part of the grey matter to another part of grey matter, so to speak. We also have the thalamus. The thalamus, which is here, is your relay station. So this receives most of the sensory information that's coming in through the spinal cord and through the cranial nerves, and it processes that, or basically relays it to the correct location. So it might relay it to this area here, which is your somatosensory cortex, for example. So that's to do with touch and pressure and pain and proprioception, which is where are my joints in space. It might relay it to the occipital lobe and the visual cortex, which is at the back. Okay, so that'll be the visual information. And it filters out irrelevant information, the stuff that just isn't really very important at all. Okay, so we've all got examples of where we might be sitting in a bar or in a cafe or something, and you're chatting to someone next to you. And when you're chatting to them, there's lots of background noise. And you're not really paying attention to it. It's all being filtered out. The thalamus is going, not relevant, not relevant, not relevant. And then all of a sudden you hear your name mentioned. And all of a sudden the thalamus has woken up. And now you're no longer listening to the friend that you were talking to, but you're listening to a different conversation. And that's because the thalamus has decided that now your name has been mentioned, that information, that conversation is no longer irrelevant. So it's a relay station, but also a filtering station. You have the hypothalamus. This controls a wide array of brain functions and other functions. So it controls a huge amount of hormonal release from the pituitary gland. It's where we have our fullness and our satiety centers. It's to do with our limbic system as well, which is to do with our emotions. There are lots and lots of centers present within the hypothalamus. We have our brainstem. So we've got your midbrain, your pons, your medulla oblongata. You have a lot of control centers in there. So your cardiovascular control center, your respiratory control center, your vomiting control center, a whole array that are present there. So obviously that is essential that works for life. So if you get a stroke in your brainstem, it's most often going to be lethal because of the number of control centers that are there. And then that leads down, of course, into your spinal cord, and then the nerves coming out of those, so the peripheral nerves. And you have your cerebellum, which helps to provide coordinated skeletal muscle movements. But the brain has evolved significantly over millions of years, and it's evolved in a couple of key areas. So if we're just taking a quick look at the rat, the cat, the chimp, and the human, you can see we've all got these sensory areas. So in the occipital lobe, you've got visual, 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 and visual. So these little sensory areas. And these sensory areas give you basic concepts. Okay, so your auditory sensory area will give you information about pitch and tone, but not a lot more. And what's important is you've got these pink areas. These are your association areas. And these then give you more detail. They start to interpret it into specific sounds if we're talking about pitch and tone. And your visual, so your occipital lobe at the back here, it might see your colors and your tones and your edges, but the visual association area starts to recognize this structure like a face or an object. Likewise, this little green region you can see here, this is your somatosensory area. And so this receives the senses of touch and pressure and pain and gives you crude sensations of them. And the somatosensory association area determines what it actually is. So what something is that you might be touching, for example, that you can't see because you may have felt it before. So if you're looking at a comparison of the association areas in humans, working all your way down to the chimp, the cat, and the rat, you can see very little association area in the rat. And that means there's really very little interpretation of the senses going on in the rat. They mainly just obviously run around looking for food, recognizing things as dangerous or not, and whether it's food or not. They don't have that interpretation going on. So the cerebrum itself is what we'll talk about first of all, and it's highly developed. It makes up about 80% of the total brain weight. It's your site of conscious thought, intellect, memory, sensation. And it's divided into left and right cerebral hemispheres. And so your left hemisphere, so this excels in your logical, your analytical, sequential and verbal tasks. So things like your maths, your language and your philosophy. Your right excels in the non-language skills, so spatial perception, artistic and musical talents. And the corpus callosum, which is white matter, and this is shown in the diagram here, this is the bridge between the left and right cerebral hemispheres. So it's all about information transfer between one hemisphere and the other hemisphere. And here you can see the thalamus, which remember is your relay station. You can see your cerebral cortex, which is the outer bit of the cerebrum. And you've got your basal nuclei. So we'll talk about those a little bit later, but they are also to do with coordinated movements. So basically the basal nuclei, the cerebellum and the cerebrum all work together to have nice, smooth muscle movements. And they're working with visual information and with balance and posture and that kind of thing. And the brain is obviously further separated into lobes. And if we're to look at the CNS structure and function in terms of that grey and white matter that I've already been talking about, it's the outer grey matter, which we can show in this area here. So you've got this outer grey matter. It's about somewhere between 2 and 4 millimeters thick. And this processes and coordinates sensory information. For example, touch in the somatosensory cortex. It allows motor commands. So in your primary motor cortex, so movement, but also your higher brain functions, so your conscious thought, your memories, and your emotions. So this is through a section through your brain. And you can see a similar section, this time through a transverse plane through the spinal cord. And again, you can see the grey matter in this H or in this butterfly shape. And remember that grey matter is there for processing. And the white matter that you can see absolutely everywhere, that's the cables. So it's transmitting information from one place to another. So it's transmitting information up and down the spinal cord towards the brain, for example. So like I said, the cerebrum itself, the surfaces of the two hemispheres are covered by this very, very folded neural grey matter. That's your cerebral cortex. And it's separated into lobes. And so in this diagram, you can see the frontal lobe, you can see the parietal lobe, and you can see the occipital lobe. So the frontal lobe, that's where all the executive functions are. So the real thinking, processing going on. The parietal lobe, this is where you've got your somatosensory cortex and other areas as well. And the occipital lobe, this is where you've got your visual cortex. But the cerebral cortex has what are called gyri, which are basically elevated ridges. And this allows us to increase the surface area. And by increasing the surface area, of course, you're increasing the processing power. And so you can see here, you can see a precentral gyrus and a post-central gyrus. The gyri are separated by shallow depressions, so these are your sulci, or your deeper groove, which are your fissures. So here's your longitudinal fissure, and here is your central sulcus. And just looking at this is yet another little diagram again, so it's showing the longitudinal fissure. It's also showing you the corpus callosum, so I want you to quickly have a think, what does the corpus callosum do? And then you've got your left and your right cerebral hemispheres, your spinal cord and your cerebellum. So what does the corpus callosum do? What does the cerebellum do? Remember, the corpus callosum is about transferring information between one hemisphere and the other, and the cerebellum is all to do with smooth muscle movements. So have a look at this quick question and press pause. and answer it clearly. So what does the longitudinal fissure separate? Well, it separates the two hemispheres. Nice, easy one there. Separating the two hemispheres apart, separating the left and the right. What does the central sulcus separate? Well, it separates the frontal lobe from the parietal lobe. And why do we have sulci and gyri? Well, together they increase the surface area of the cerebral cortex, which allows more neurons to be packed into the cortex and therefore increases the brain's ability to process information. And just as a matter of information for you or interest, your brain actually has a unique pattern of sulci and gyri, and it's as individual as a fingerprint. So we all have a very different pattern there, but I wouldn't suggest we use it instead of a fingerprint, obviously. So if we're looking again at the cerebral cortex, or the cerebrum rather, remembering that the cerebral cortex, it's the executive suite of the nervous system where a conscious mind is found. And remember, it contains the lobes, which are divided by our sulci. And if we're looking at these different lobes, these are what are shown here. So you've got your frontal lobe, you can see your parietal lobe, your occipital lobe, your temporal lobe. And we're also looking at different areas. So you've got your sensory cortex, so that's your somatosensory cortex. So it's for your somatic senses, so touch, pressure, pain, proprioception. You've got your motor cortex, so your primary motor cortex. So you stimulate neurons in this region, and this will pass action potentials down the spinal cord to the relevant skeletal muscle, which will therefore be stimulated. And there's a specific pattern, and we'll talk about that pattern later on. So if we're looking at your frontal lobe, which is this entire region up to the motor cortex, this is your executive suite, if you like. So this is where you've got all your conscious awareness, your conscious thoughts going on, lots of thinking going on. But it's also contained your motor cortex, your primary motor cortex, and other regions, which are involved in voluntary control of skeletal muscle. You've got your parietal lobe, which has got your conscious perception of touch, pressure, pain, vibration, taste, and temperature. So basically within your somatosensory cortex for touch, pressure, pain, vibration, and temperature. Also to a limited extent taste, but you do have your gustatory cortex elsewhere as well. You have your occipital lobe, which is all to do with your visual cortex and your conscious perception of vision. You have your temporal lobe, where you have your auditory and olfactory cortex. So olfaction is obviously smell. And so therefore you have your conscious perception of auditory and olfactory stimuli. And finally, all of the lobes, you have association areas. And these association areas, they integrate and process information from the relevant senses. So your visual cortex will have a visual association area using local memories to process that information and give meaning to it. Likewise, the auditory cortex and the auditory association area, the olfactory cortex, the olfactory association area, they all allow you to get the basic concepts with the sensory area and then processing it and interpreting it in the association area.
This is our lab, where we're going to push our own bodies to the limit to show you how your body works. That really hurt. Just don't try anything you see here at home. Today, it's the brain.
Your body is an amazing machine, but it can't do anything without your brain. Now, your brain is what makes you, you. But it also tells the different parts of your body what to do. So if I want to move my fingers, I have to send an electrical signal from here to here. And that moves really fast. It goes at over 250 miles an hour. That's faster than a Formula One racing car. So we want to know more about where in the brain these signals come from. And in order to do that, we're going to use this multi-pulse transcranial magnetic stimulator. It's a big magnet.
But it's a cool big magnet. It sends electromagnetic pulses to the brain, which interfere with the brain's own electrical signals. And that means we can use it to work out which bit of the brain does what. Let's give this brain scrambler a whirl.
Chris, what I want you to do first of all is reach up with your left hand and pick your nose. All right? Perfect. Did it perfectly. That's lovely. Now I'm going to get you to do the same thing again, but this time I'm going to try and interfere with the brain scrambler. So Chris, when you're ready, pick your nose.
Every time Chris's finger wiggles, That's the magnet or brain scrambler interfering with his brain signals, which means he can't pick his nose properly.
You miss?
But the magnetic brain scrambler is also showing us which part of Chris's brain controls his left hand.
I'm on the right side of Chris's body, but it's his left hand that's twitching. Now that's because your brain is wired back to front. So the right side of his brain controls the left side of his body and vice versa. So let's now try it on the other side. And you ready? Go.
So now I'm interfering with the left side of Chris's brain, and look, his right hand is all over the place.
I feel like a cup of tea. That sounds lovely.
Actually, it's me that's drinking the tea, and it's cold tea, but you'll see why. I reckon we can have a bit of fun with this brain scrambler. Oop, there it goes. The brain scrambler is interfering with our brain's normal signals, and it's creating a right mess.
So really what that information is telling us is that our sensory and motor pathways cross from one side of the body. So in other words, the left side of the brain is controlling the skeletal muscles on the right side of the body. And likewise, the sensations in the right side of the body are being interpreted on the left side of the brain. Okay, so really the sensory and motor pathways cross the midline on their way to and from the cerebral hemispheres. That crossing over process is called decussation, and therefore each cerebral hemisphere is concerned with the sensations and actions of the contralateral side, just to get some terminologies moving into your mind. So if we're looking at this little image on the right-hand side, you can see this is to do with motor pathway, so skeletal muscle movement, and you can see your primary motor cortex, so your primary motor cortex here. And if we were to stimulate neurons in the primary motor cortex, the action potentials would pass down through the pyramidal decussation. They'd cross over onto the opposite side of the body, down the corticospinal tract, because it's going from the cortex to the spine, so corticospinal tract, and then where it would leave through the lower motor neuron and stimulate at the level of the skeletal muscle. So you can see when you're stimulated, when your left arm is moving, it's actually the right side of your brain that is controlling it. So if we're going back over this particular area about the different areas of the brain, we're thinking there are sensory areas where you get conscious awareness of the sensation. You have the association areas which integrate those senses that are coming in. So they can either be a visual association area, which is shown down here. You can see here's your occipital lobe, which is your visual cortex, which gives you conscious awareness of the sensation, and the visual association area, which integrates visual information only. So it's only interpreting visual information. Okay, same thing with the auditory cortex and hearing and the auditory association area. It's only interpreting auditory information. And we can go the same thing with gustatory and the olfactory cortexes as well. So therefore, we need to be able to bring all of these areas together. And that's where we have higher order association areas that we'll talk about shortly. So we have sensory areas, we have association areas, and we have the motor areas, which control our voluntary movements. And there are a few of those different areas. We have the primary motor cortex, for example. We have the premotor cortex as another example. If we look at this is your somatosensory cortex. So it's just sitting in the parietal lobe. And just to remember, this is this part of the sensory system concerned with the conscious perception of touch, pressure, pain, temperature, position, movement, vibration. So in other words, it's sensing receptive information coming from your muscles, your joints, your skin, and your fascia, such as your connective tissue that surrounds your muscles or muscle groups, your blood vessels, and your nerves. And so this is just a body map showing the primary motor cortex and the somatosensory cortex of the regions of the cerebrum. And so this is your precentral gyrus, and this is your postcentral gyrus. And precentral gyrus just means primary motor cortex, and postcentral gyrus really is your somatosensory cortex. Okay, and all it's saying is in each of these regions, this little region here is associated with your hip and your trunk. So in your primary motor cortex, this is your shoulder. So if we were to stimulate this region, you'd get shoulder movement. Stimulate this region, we'd get elbow. Move on down, stimulate these regions, we'd stimulate the eye. And likewise, these are the areas that are receiving the sensory information. So this region receives the information from the nose. This region receives information from the fingers. So the thalamus is sending it to these specific regions. We also have the motor areas of the cerebral cortex. So they, like I said, they lie in the frontal lobe and they control voluntary movement. And so we have the primary motor cortex. Okay, so this is this region. So that lies in the precentral gyrus, as we've already talked about. We have the premotor cortex, which is the region there. Okay, that is anterior to the precentral gyrus. Then we have Broca's area, which is down by here, which lies anterior to the premotor cortex. And you have the frontal eye field, and that is within and anterior to the premotor cortex, whilst being superior to Broca's area. And the cortical area called the frontal eye field plays an important role in the control of visual attention and eye movement. So in other words, electrical stimulation of the frontal eye field elicits quick, simultaneous movement of both eyes that abruptly change the point of fixation. They range in amplitude from the small movements made while reading, for example, to much larger movements made while gazing around a room. So now we'll just do a little bit more detail on the motor areas that are involved in voluntary movement. So we have our primary motor cortex, and this is where you have neuronal, what are called pyramidal cells, that control the precise and skilled movement. So in other words, as you stimulate those neurons, you stimulate eventually individual muscle fibers to contract. And so what's happening, the long fibers are projecting down to the spinal cord through massive pyramidal tracts. They're also called corticospinal tracts because they're moving from the cortex to the spine. And then these pyramidal cells that control hand movements are all in one place. Those that control feet are in another. That's the mattotopy. And that's that map that I showed you a little bit earlier. We also have the premotor cortex. And the premotor cortex relays voluntary movement instructions to the primary motor cortex. So the premotor cortex, remember where that is? So the neurons of the primary motor cortex must be stimulated by neurons in other parts of the cerebrum. And the premotor cortex is responsible for coordination of learned movements. In other words, patterns have been stored there. So what happens is, with repetition, a proper pattern of stimulation becomes stored in the premotor cortex. So in other words, it controls learned, repetitious or patterned motor skills, such as typing or playing a musical instrument. It also uses highly processed sensory information from other cortical regions. It controls voluntary actions that depend on sensory feedback. For example, moving an arm through a maze to grasp an object. And so therefore, what is actually happening? It can coordinate the movement of several muscle groups simultaneously or sequentially, partly by activating the primary motor cortex. So movement can now be performed smoothly and easily by triggering a pattern rather than by controlling individual neurons. For example, any learned movements, that might be picking up a glass of water or playing the piano, whatever it might be. So in other words, the premotor cortex is the memory bank for skilled motor movements. We also have our sensory areas, and we've talked about these a little bit already. So these receive information from sensory receptors and allow conscious awareness of sensation. So that can be general, which is your somatosensory cortex. It can be visual, so your visual cortex. It can be auditory, and it can be olfactory and gustatory. And the association areas, of course, they receive information from the sensory area and integrate this with memories to produce an understanding of the object or the sense that's coming in. So, for example, the somatosensory area monitors activity in the somatosensory cortex. The somatosensory association area monitors activity in the somatosensory cortex, so it can determine what an object is from its size, texture, and temperature, and by using local memories as well. Of course, the visceral sensory area is involved in the conscious perception of visceral sensations. For example, an upset stomach, a full bladder, or full lungs. So we also have that visceral information that's coming into the somatosensory cortex. So now we're going to talk a little bit about the higher order association areas. So these carry out complex mental processes that are not associated with any one particular sense. In other words, it's going to be using more than one sense, if you like. So each sensory association area sends signals to higher order association areas, which combine this information to form the basis of the highest mental processes. So Wernicke's area, which you can see in this diagram. So Wernicke's area is all about understanding the written and the spoken messages. So it interprets information from visual, auditory, and somatosensory areas, somatosensory association areas. Because how do we understand language? Well, we can read it, we can listen to it. Or if you're thinking somatosensory, you can be thinking about braille, so you're thinking about touch. Wernicke's area is only present in one hemisphere, typically the left. And like I said, it gets information from those three different senses to allow us to fully interpret a language, understand language. It also goes on to formulate coherent speech patterns, which are then transferred to Broca's area. In other words, translating the message into a programmed sound pattern. And then the sound pattern or the sound program is conveyed to the primary motor cortex to activate the relevant muscles for speech. We also have a prefrontal association cortex, and this integrates sensory information from all association areas. So in other words, it's got the most inputs coming into it, and it's therefore got the most processing power. It allows us to plan for voluntary activities. It allows us to just make good, robust decisions, hopefully. So it weighs up the consequences of your actions, potential actions. It's your creativity. It's where your personality lies. It's your personality traits based on a whole array of things that go on during your life, of course. And it's the site of your working memory. So the brain is storing and actively manipulating information used in reasoning and planning in this region. But at the same time, it's also responsible for your feelings of frustration, tension, and anxiety. So in other words, we're thinking about the prefrontal cortex is involved with intellect, complex learning activities, recall, and personality. And that all depends on negative and positive feedback from life events. But of course, if your connections between the prefrontal cortex and other brain regions are severed, then the frustrations and tensions and anxieties are removed. And that's why in the 20th century, they used to use prefrontal lobotomy to cure a variety of mental illnesses, such as hallucinations and severe pain. But at the same time, by breaking off those connections, they also became equally unconcerned by tact, decorum, and a variety of other things like toilet training, for example. They just didn't care because whilst the frustrations and tensions, anxieties may have been removed, other issues kicked in. But the interesting thing about the prefrontal association cortex, of course, is that electrical stimulation of regions within this is under investigation as potential therapy for a variety of disorders, as well as drugs being used for some of these disorders as well. So the next little part that we're going to go through is white matter. So we're thinking about the cerebrum again, and we're thinking about the white matter. And white matter is all about transferring information. So it's responsible for communication between cerebral areas, but also the cerebral cortex and lower central nervous system centers. And what we have myelinated fibers are bundled into large tracts. And so we have, within the CNS, within the brain itself, we have association fibers. And so these association fibers interconnect areas of neural cortex within a single cerebral hemisphere. So the shorter fibers, which you can see here, are your arcuate fibers, and they curve from one gyri to another. And the longer longitudinal fasciculi, these connect one lobe to another. So you can see how much longer they are, connecting lobes together. We then have the commissural fibers, and these interconnect and permit communication between the hemispheres. So they would include things such as your anterior commissure and your corpus callosum, of course. Interestingly, the corpus callosum has 250 million axons, carrying around about 4 billion impulses per second. We then go on and you've got your projection fibers, and your projection fibers link the cerebral cortex to the diencephalon, the brainstem, the cerebellum, the spinal cord, all going via the internal capsule. And what is the internal capsule? Well, it's an area where most motor and sensory fibers travel to and from the cerebral cortex. So it's just really just an area, a capsule where they travel. We're now going to talk about the basal nuclei, also called the basal ganglia. I like to use the term nuclei because nuclei is a term used for clusters of nerves, usually within the grey matter. But like I said, it's also called the basal ganglia, but usually ganglia are restricted to the peripheral nervous system, not the central nervous system, hence why I don't like to use the word basal ganglia, but they are used interchangeably. So what are the basal nuclei? Well, these are masses of grey matter that lie deep within the cerebral white matter. And you can see some of these regions. So hopefully you can all remember what the thalamus is. Okay, that's your relay station, which projects your sensory information to the correct part of the cerebral cortex. And so what you have radiating projection and commissural fibers travel around and between these nuclei, and they receive input from the entire cerebral cortex. And they play a very complex role in controlling movement. And I'll try and explain what they actually do in a few minutes. For example, if you're picking up a pencil, you consciously reach and grasp with your forearm, wrist, and hand, while the basal nuclei operate at the subconscious level to position your shoulder and stabilize your arm. And when you're walking, the basal nuclei control the cycles of arm and thigh movements that occur between the time you decide to start walking and the time you give the order to stop. So it's these subconscious movements that are going on. So the basal nuclei are involved in the subconscious control of skeletal muscle tone and coordination of learned movements, for example, your body posture. They influence muscle control. They don't initiate movements, but once a movement is underway, the basal nuclei provide that general pattern and rhythm, especially the trunk and the proximal limb muscles. Think about walking and those movements of the arms to and from. That's all being controlled by the basal nuclei. So therefore, they're monitoring, coordinating slow, sustained contractions involved in posture and support. They inhibit muscle tone throughout the body by acting through neurons in the brainstem, and they suppress useless or unwanted patterns of movement. So the basal nuclei, in summary, don't directly influence efferent motor neurons that are coming down from the primary motor cortex, but they do modify ongoing activity in the motor pathways. So it's still, in terms of their definitive functions, it's very hard to study because they're very inaccessible. So they're located deep within the white matter, deep within the cerebrum, and the motor functions seem to overlap a lot with that of the cerebellum. So people get a little bit confused because they seem to be very similar in terms of their functions. But we do get disorders of the basal nuclei, and that can result in too much movement, for example, in Huntington's disease, or too little, for example, in Parkinson's disease. So what's actually happening at the level of the basal nuclei? Well, the basal nuclei, they receive information from the cerebral cortex through two different parts, the putamen and the caudate nucleus. The information is then processed there and also in the globus pallidus. And the output leaves the globus pallidus and synapses into the thalamus. And this projects information to the premotor cortex to influence movement. So that's really what's happening. So the whole part of the basal nuclei is receiving information, processing information, and then passing that information via the thalamus to the premotor cortex, where movements are modified. And the activity of the basal nuclei is inhibited by neurons in the substantia nigra of the midbrain. And the neurotransmitter is dopamine in this case. So the diagram again is showing the caudate nucleus and the globus pallidus. So it's showing your basal nuclei. You've got your thalamus then, you've got your cerebellum. And the amygdala is to do with emotions, so it's part of your limbic system. But there you've got your substantia nigra. And this inhibits the activity of the basal nuclei by releasing dopamine. So what would happen if the substantia nigra is damaged? Press pause and have a think. So if the substantia nigra is damaged, it means it will release less dopamine. And if less dopamine is secreted, the basal nuclei will become more active, and so therefore would eventually lead to a gradual generalized increase in muscle tone, for example, like in Parkinson's. And Parkinson's sufferers have difficulty starting voluntary movements because the opposing muscle groups don't want to relax. They need to be overpowered. So once a movement is underway, every aspect has to be voluntarily controlled through intense effort and concentration, and that leads to your tremors and your shaking. The last part of this session that we're going to cover is the structure and the function of the cerebellum, and we're only going to be really touching at it on quite a peripheral level. The cerebellum is composed of somewhere between 10 and 12 cents of brain mass, and it also has hemispheres covered by grey matter, which is your cerebellar cortex. And it's important in balance and in planning and executing voluntary movements. And it adjusts ongoing movements by comparing sensations with previously experienced sensations. So it helps to coordinate your balance, your posture, and ensures that your movements are smooth. So the cerebellum activity occurs subconsciously, so we have no awareness of its functioning. And so what will happen is the cerebral cortex, so if you want to go somewhere, if you want to stand up and walk somewhere, your cerebral cortex basically notifies the cerebellum of an intent to make a muscle movement, to walk somewhere, to pick up a glass of water, whatever it might be. It then uses the visual information and the proprioceptive information and the balance situation in your inner ear. And remember what proprioception is? It's where are my joints in space? So you always know where your joints are in space, okay, whether your eyes are open or closed. So it's looking, where am I now? Where do I want to go to? It's saying, where are my joints at the moment? And it's also saying, how am I balanced? And so then the cerebellum calculates the force, the direction, and the contraction strength to perform the action that you actually want to do. That blueprint is dispatched to the motor cortex, which stimulates coordinated stimulation of motor neurons from the primary motor cortex. Of course, it's not all that easy. There are other processes involved. You've got the basal nuclei involved, and you've got to bring all those other senses in together. And if we look at the cerebellum itself, to do all these executive functions that it has to do, it has three different parts. And what they actually do, it actually says in their name, or it helps in their name. For example, the vestibulocerebellum. It adjusts muscle tone in response to vestibular stimuli. In other words, where is my head in space? What is my head doing? Is it rotating? Is it static? Is it looking down? Is it looking up? So that's your vestibular apparatus in your inner ear. So it's adjusting muscle tone in response to that vestibular information, and it's helping to control eye movement. You've then got your spinocerebellum, and that can anticipate the future position of body parts during the course of movement. So in other words, it's controlling muscle tone of muscles involved with any changes in posture and movement. And then you've got your cerebrocerebellum. This receives the input of your intent to move, so it's receiving information from the cerebral cortex and evaluates the sensory information for action. So in other words, it's involved in planning and initiating those voluntary activity that is about to occur by providing input to the cortical motor areas. So it helps to refine the voluntary and fine movements. So overall, we've got three main parts of the brain, of the central nervous system rather, that are involved in movement control, and there are others. So you've got your primary motor cortex. This control is involved in control of movement and synergy, so it executes the movement. So you stimulate the nerves within the primary motor cortex, and that'll stimulate various muscles to contract. You have your basal nuclei. This is your motor sequence learning, so it allows movements to become subconscious once voluntary movement has actually started. So they project information into the cortical areas, including the premotor cortex, because of course the premotor cortex has a role in controlling proximal muscles involved in from the primary motor cortex. So remembering what it's doing, the basal nuclei are allowing movements to become involuntary once movement has voluntarily started. So in other words, an example would be following walking over a puddle, it makes it movement subconscious again. In other words, it makes your arms and your legs move in rhythm. So you walk in a nice rhythm up to a puddle where you suddenly change and jump over the puddle, and then it's the basal nuclei that makes that walking nice, your arms and legs move in rhythm again. And then you've got your cerebellum, which is all about motor adaptation. It receives lots and lots of information from your vestibular apparatus, from your visual cortex, from your cerebral cortex. It brings all that information together and throws out a blueprint for the initiation of controlled movements. And it compares the intended movements descending from the cortical motor areas with the actual movements detected by activity of muscle neurons. So in other words, it's helping to make the movements smooth and appropriate.